So, welcome everybody to our professional development webinar for July featuring the Dr. Allison L. Norton, who is the Associate Professor of Migration Studies and Congregational Life. Um, I, as is our wont, we would like to just start out by just giving a brief background of the Religion Communicators Council, who we are and who we represent. So the RCC was founded in 1929, and it's an association of communications professionals who work for and with a diverse group of faith-based organizations in the areas of communications, public relations, advertising, and development. And one of the things that we are very proud of is the diversity among our membership, both in terms of our religious backgrounds. Um, we are truly an interfaith organization, and we take great pride in that. But also our professional backgrounds. We really do have people working in all aspects of communications, from face-to-face public relations types jobs to printing and news writing to graphic design. And yet we all are able to find something in common with other people and learn from each other, and to sometimes commiserate with each other, but also to joy with each other in our successes. Um, the couple of things of note. One of them is that in addition to our professional development webinars, I do want to plug our upcoming convention. It will be in Salt Lake City this next year from April 15th to 17th. And this one is going to be a very special convention because we are doing it in conjunction with the Religion News Writers Association and the International Association of Religious Journalists. And so it's going to be this trifecta of organizations that are all going to be working together. And it should have some really, really good, interesting content. We've already been in talks with them. It's going to be, I think, one of the more memorable conventions that you can go to. So please mark it on your calendar and plan to be in Salt Lake City, April 15th to 17th. File your taxes a day early so that you can be there on the 15th. Uh, and then finally, just a little bit of housekeeping. If during the webinar you want to pose a question, I think we're a small enough group that you could probably just raise your hand. But if you want to put your questions in the chat box, then I will also be monitoring that, as will Dr. Norton. So just give you a little bit more background. Dr. Allison Norton is an associate professor. I cannot say associate professor. There we go. Of Migration Studies and Congregational Life at Hartford International University, where she directs the Pastoral Innovation Network of New England and co-directs the Hartford Institute for Religion Research. She teaches courses in sociology of religion, immigration, and multicultural and intergenerational ministry. Her research and publications explore the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on U.S. congregations, the rise of megachurches in West Africa, the transnational dimension of African Pentecostalism, the role of migration on the worldwide expansion of the Christian faith, and the religious identities of the new second generation. But it's really that first bit, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on U.S. congregations, that she'll be speaking to us today. I was presenting at something else yesterday in terms of my work, and thinking about how much the world has changed in the last 10 years. Um, Even since I started my job here and working with the Religion Communicators Council, so much has changed in terms of the way we interact, the way we harness technology, the way we worship, and our opportunities for worship. And we like to think, because I think the COVID pandemic time was so trying for so many of us, we like to just put it in a rearview mirror and not think, that was long ago now, right? But it really wasn't that long ago, and we're just now understanding some of the effects of the pandemic, um, the maybe some of the long-term trends that have been caused by the pandemic. And so we're really excited to hear from Dr. Norton today, who will discuss all of this. So please, Dr. Norton, the floor is yours.
Yeah, wonderful to be here with all of you. I think that was a perfect introduction, Ryan, that for some of us it feels like the pandemic was long ago, and yet if we would actually compare some of our day-to-day experiences, we realize that there has been some enduring impact. in ways that now we take for granted. So what I'm going to do is share a bunch of data with you all from our Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations study. So it's going to be a lot of information, but we'll also have time for Q&A and kind of deeper, richer conversation afterward. Um, but most of the data I'm going to share today comes out of our most recent survey. And I also want to just highlight again that this is not just me by myself, right? I direct the Hartford Institute for Religion Research, and we are a large team of folks who have been working on this project over the last now almost 6 years with a bunch of postdoctoral researchers and communications and research assistants. So, before we get into the details of the findings, I just want to situate this particular survey in the broader project. So, EPIC, Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations, is a national mixed methods research project that's specifically focused on congregations and congregational life. And what we provide is a little bit of a different view than what you'll find from Pew and Gallup and PRI, because they're surveying individuals, right, and trying to get the perspective of individual religious identities and practices. We're trying to look at the trends that are affecting congregational spaces, and this is multi-faith research. Any given time we do a survey, we have between 25 and 35 different faith groups participating in that project. And then we also do random samples to try to capture even more diversity. So we draw on the FACT survey series, Faith Communities Today survey series, and that has been running since 2000. So we really are able to look at long-term trends, not just the last 5 years of the pandemic impact, but really trends before. So in this data, you'll hear me really holding sort of in parallel two trend lines. One is what happened that was a result of the pandemic that we can see from our data collected from 2021 up until current. And then more clearly, what are those trends and how do they fit within that broader 25-year timeline? So, orienting us to the landscape of congregations in the US, this infographic gives us a quick portrait of the sort of typical American congregation. So, congregations are often long established institutions. The median was founded in 1964. They are also relatively small on average, though most attenders are concentrated in the largest congregations. And I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. 30% of congregations are multiracial. So that means that a single racial group doesn't have more than 80% of the people. And if we look at the demographics, the people, the attenders, they are about 58% female, about 1/3 are age 65 and older, 43% college grads. On the clergy side, looking at the clergy profile, right, we see median age is 56, 88% are male, and about 71% serve full time. Honing in a little bit more on the pandemic, 76% of congregations did suspend their in-person worship at some point. You think about the lockdown period stage. And the median disruption lasted about 6 months for those that suspended in-person worship. So at the heart of what I'm going to look at today, I'm going to walk through 9 key measures of congregational vitality. So you kind of see some of them listed here: attendance, financial giving, identity, invitational evangelistic efforts, willingness to change, etc. And the big story, the big headline here is that across nearly all of these indicators, we see a consistent pattern. In 2021, right in that middle of that early pandemic period, many indicators actually spiked. So congregations clarified their mission and their identity coming out of the crisis of the pandemic. They embraced change and they showed generosity. right? So we saw a sort of spike, increase in giving, increase in congregational willingness to change, etc. But then when we went back in 2023, that survey showed a very different picture and reality. That many of those gains that came as congregations embraced the kind of ways that the pandemic forced them into new change and new reality, they actually reversed. And this ongoing disruption tended to take its toll. But now in 2025, when we look at our latest data, we see yet a new story emerging. And often these indicators have rebounded even above the pre-pandemic baseline. So I'm going to get a little more into this. But this pattern tells a story about congregational life that has an initial surge of adaptation after the pandemic, followed by a sense of withdrawal and fatigue and exhaustion. And then followed by recommitment and a bit of a rebound that we are experiencing more recently. So let's turn first to attendance. Let me start here. So in 2025, you'll see that the median in-person worship attendance has risen to 70. And what is most striking is just looking at this trend line, that this is actually the first directional change that we've seen since we first started tracking this feature. So that 65 is our pre-pandemic baseline. That was right before the lockdown period. That data came from early 2020. And then, not surprisingly, 2021 in person had dipped to 45, slowly rebounded. And as a surprise to all of us on our team, we actually saw an increase from the pre-pandemic baseline. So that the median is up to 70 of in-person worship. And so this directional change doesn't signal that we're back to 2000, right, with a in-person meeting of 137, but it does matter. And it shows that for many congregational leaders, there's some evidence that for the first time in a long time, there's a little bit of a shift in the trajectory, even if it's a modest shift. So there's a real aggregate change in the national level data that can look different congregation to congregation. As I mentioned a little bit in the beginning, congregational size remains highly unequal. So most congregations are small, often very small, but most of the people who attend congregations go to the big ones. So you see across the top that 78% of attenders, okay, 70% of all people who go attend a congregation do so in the very largest congregations, which are 250 people or more in attendance. And then you can see that 40% of the congregations have only 4% of the people attending them. So those are the congregations that are the small, 50 or less, have only 4% of the total share of attenders. So when we talk about these median changes, it helps us to keep in mind that although the number of small congregations remain large, actual religious participation tends to concentrate in the larger spaces. And we see that also larger congregations are the ones that are most likely to continue growing. So this gap is getting larger. It has been increasing. And if we look at these growth patterns more broadly, we see that the long-term trend through 2023 was one of decline. But in our latest 2025 data that I show you here, that pattern reverses. So now we see that 43% of congregations are growing and 40%, 46% declining. And so we see much more evenness in the numbers of congregations that report that they're growing compared to declining. The other thing I think is striking about this is a lot of times congregations think that they're in a space of stability. And the reality is that's true for very few. Very few are either declining or growing. Hardly any of them are just sort of holding stable or steady. There is difference across traditions here. Evangelical Protestant congregations are the only ones showing net growth. Catholic Orthodox and non Christian traditions are pretty stable, and mainline Protestants continue to experience the steepest decline. So when you break this out, you see some different stories emerging. Really importantly, though, the growth here is concentrated in mid-size evangelical churches. So those that are in the sort of 50 to 100 and 100 to 150, they grew by 8 and 14% respectively in this last 2 years. So that's why we see that uptick in the median. Okay, let's talk about finances for a little bit. So congregational income has increased substantially. And it has, and this is important to note, it's outpaced inflation. So we see a major driver of this change being electronic giving, and this was very much a pandemic effect on congregations. The share of congregations offering online giving rose from 58% to 76%. And the share of contributions received electronically similarly rose from 10% to 40%. So what this does with this kind of growth in the financial resources is it does reduce some of the friction. That people don't need to be there physically present to remember to give if they can give electronically, right? It can be more stabilized, automatic, consistent. And we do also see differences by tradition here as well. Catholic and Orthodox churches report the highest median income compared to the other faith groups. At the same time, those of you who are closely connected to congregations will know that expenses has also increased substantially, from 108,000 in 2020 to 199,000 just 5 years later. And much of this is driven by operational costs, especially insurance, which nearly three-quarters of congregations report as having increased sharply. So what we see is a bit of a shift in the budget composition. About half of congregations say they're operating in a surplus, compared to 38% in 2020. And so there's been a bit of a restructuring in the financial life for many congregations. Okay, I'm going to move to another one of these markers that we're trying to understand, and that is the identity of the congregation, congregational identity. So we ask about mission clarity, right? Does this congregation have a clear sense of their mission and purpose? We ask about spiritual vitality. We don't define what spiritual vitality would be. We just say, how much do you agree that this congregation is spiritually vital and alive? We ask about their involvement in the local community, and we ask about are they striving to be diverse? And we look across these four measures, we see the same pattern: a rise, a fall, and a rise. So congregations increased on a lot of these in 2021, right, as they were really trying to respond to the crisis of the pandemic and the way in which they had to adjust and be forced to change. But then they declined in 2023 and then rebounded in 2025, often above those pre-pandemic levels. So this is very much an arc where we see some crisis-driven clarity early on, followed by some fatigue and withdrawal, and then now a sort of sense of commitment and recalibration in this latest data. And what I'll just want to say kind of over and over again here is what is notable about this last round of data from the end of 2025 is that these levels are not just recoveries. Remember, I mentioned we're looking at now like a 25-year arc, right? These levels are not just recoveries, but oftentimes they exceed the pre-pandemic baseline, which suggests that something more durable has been internalized in the ways that congregations have responded to the pandemic over the last now almost 6 years. Another area where we see change is in the outward facing activity of congregations. So we ask questions about, is your congregation actively looking for new members? is your congregation involved in recruiting new members? And so when we look at some of these changes, we do see a bit of a renewed attention to invitational efforts. Um, but our attender data complicates this picture a little bit. We did a survey of 24,000 attenders in 2024, and we found there that 69% of folks are just switching congregations, right? So they're going one place and then for a variety of reasons, the number one being they want alignment with their personal beliefs, values, and perspectives, they end up choosing a different congregation. So one of the impacts of the pandemic that we see is that because it was so highly politicized and that oftentimes the responses that churches and spaces of sort of cross the faith tradition took with things like masking and social distancing and opening or closing, right? It actually was a sort of a trigger point for folks that maybe didn't feel that that aligned with their personal values to then do some switching and go somewhere else. So we saw a lot of that happen in that early first year into the pandemic. But another trend we see in the data is an increase of new people entering congregations. It's small, but it is real. So after dipping in 2021 and 2022, the annual new attender rate has rebounded to 4% in 2025, and this is slightly higher than the 2020 baseline of 3.8%. So this is modest, but if you think across tens of thousands of congregations, it does represent a flow of people finding new congregational homes each year that's higher than we've seen previously. And most of this, again, reflects movement between congregations, not typically new entry into congregational life. Another thing we tend to pay really close attention to is congregations' willingness to change because this is a very powerful predictor of congregational vitality. So you see here the percent of congregations that strongly agree that their congregation is willing to change to meet new realities. And historically, this measure's been pretty low, right? So you see here 2005 up to 2015, it sort of ranges between 16 and 25% of congregations strongly agreeing. This doesn't really surprise us. I mean, congregations are by their nature tradition-oriented institutions. And so change can sometimes be experienced as a threat. But the pandemic forced something different, right? And you see this very clearly in this huge spike up to 39% strongly agreeing in 2021 that they're willing to change to meet new realities. At this time, I was doing in-depth interviews with clergy leaders, and I kept hearing over and over again that there was this repeated refrain of, don't let it be said ever again that congregations can't change. And so many leaders were recognizing that things that they had been trying to change for decades, all of a sudden their people were a lot more open, right, to exploring possibilities for change. And there was this sort of spirit of willingness to embrace the moment, to pivot, and to recalibrate as needed. So we see this very clearly in 2021. Then, as we would expect, it pulled back. Once these external pressures eased, many congregations snapped back into familiar patterns. And by 2023, it was rather alarming to us that it had fallen to 21%. But here's what's significant about 2025. So here you see it's rebounded to 29%, which is above every pre-pandemic data point in our 20-year data set. So something has shifted here, and congregations that have survived the pandemic by adapting do seem to have internalized a new posture toward change, even when they don't have that existential pressure forcing it. Okay, I'm just going to turn to um, three more items that we've been measuring, and then we'll have some conversation. So another thing we take a look at is volunteer engagement. And so we do see a return in volunteer engagement. You see that now we match what we had in our pre-pandemic baseline, that about 40% of regular participants volunteer in some capacity at their congregation. This was felt very keenly by congregational leaders when this dropped to only 15% in 2021. But now we're back to exactly where we started. So it really seems to indicate a restoration of the more relational and organizational infrastructure within congregations to provide opportunities for people to volunteer within their programs, outreach, etc. There is meaningful variation by tradition and size with volunteering. Mainline congregations lead at 50%, followed by evangelical and non-Christian congregations at 40%, and then Catholic and Orthodox parishes are about 20%. And a story of the resiliency of smaller congregations, those with 50 or fewer attenders actually have the highest proportion of volunteer rates at 48%, which really signals the all hands on deck culture of small faith communities. And related to volunteers, you need volunteers to run programs, right? So we do see also that congregational programming has rebounded. There is one exception to this. Community service activities remain at 70%, which is still meaningfully below the pre-pandemic level of 84%. But with that exception of community service, the rest of the congregational programming has rebounded. And then lastly, I just want to take a quick look at the clergy, at clergy health and well-being. You probably were paying attention to this. We had early on a Barna survey that reported, I think it was 40% of congregational leaders are considering leaving or quitting. When we look at clergy health and well-being and their willingness to maintain their vocation, we do see some movement. So when we look at clergy health and well-being across five dimensions, physical, mental, spiritual, relational, financial, we do see a sign of resurgence. And while the changes are modest, they are consistent. And so they likely reflect the sort of more stable congregational environments and the reduced crisis burden that clergy are carrying. So now, this data from 5 years after the lockdown period, there seems to be more congregational stability, which also relates to stability and a little bit of a rise in clergy health and well-being. And that's one of our findings from previous work is that there is really a relationship between the health of the clergy and the health of the congregation. Even more strikingly, we see a shift in clergy reporting a desire to leave the ministry or leave their current congregation. This is a pretty sensitive measure, and the trends the past few years have been rather alarming. In spring and fall 23, a growing share of clergy were reporting they thought fairly or very often about leaving, both leaving their current congregation and leaving the ministry altogether. And that was a warning signal to us about the long-term sustainability of folks that were serving in pastoral ministry. But continuing with the trend that we've seen in 2025, those numbers have improved significantly. 69% of clergy say they have never considered leaving their current congregation, up from 56% in fall of 2023. Now, 58% say they have never considered leaving ministry altogether, up from 47%. And meaningfully, only 8% now report thinking about leaving the profession fairly or very often. So it represents a real improvement. Again, there is some variation by tradition. Catholic and Orthodox pastors are the most stable, with 78% having never considered leaving. Mainline clergy follow behind that, 63%. Evangelical pastors, 47%. And leaders from other faith traditions are at the highest risk at 44%. So this is not a story of mass clergy departure. This is a story of stabilization and in some cases improvement in working conditions that allow clergy to step out of emergency mode and those kind of roles that were common during the pandemic and into more sustainable patterns. So when we pull all the pieces together, we see increases in congregational vitality, perceived strength. And so churches themselves say at an increased rate that we are actually stronger than we were before the pandemic. So 27% of congregations say we are much stronger now than we were before the pandemic. So we do see this kind of optimism overall in their perceptions. And we have some forward-looking attitudes when they look at their futures. There's optimism about the future. This is up. This is particularly notable given the long-term narrative of decline that is shaped for so many the kinds of conversations that kind of predominate the reality. But this future outlook it has been increasing and now exceeds even what we saw in 2015 in those congregations that say that we are thriving and we expect to continue to thrive. So, in conclusion, as we look across all of these indicators, we see that in 2025, congregations do appear stronger than they were just a few years ago. But it's important to note this is not a simple story of a revival or return to a previous era. This longer term trajectory of religious change in the US is still very much in place. But what the pandemic appears to have done in particular is to reshuffle this landscape. So it accelerated some sorting and switching as attenders have moved across congregations. And it also has created a more differentiated landscape. So some congregations are finding new energy and finding momentum, while others are struggling or declining. So this moment is distinctive because we do see higher levels of optimism and a renewed sense of what is possible moving forward. So we'll go into Q&A here in a bit, and I just want to say that all of the findings that I have shared are available in our reports. They're free on our website, covidreligionresearch.org. So check out the reports. The one I presented on from today mostly was the signs of rebound amid uneven recovery report. But I also mentioned our attender survey, which is the one right next to it. This place means everything to me. Key findings from a national survey of church attenders. So check them out if you have not already. And I'll just leave my email here for a minute, A Norton, Hartford International. So if you have more questions, want to reach out, please do. So let's see what you all are thinking. What kind of questions or curiosities has this sparked?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you very, very much, Dr. Norton. That was fascinating research all across the board. And if I may, as the moderator of today's discussion, take the first two questions, right? Which is actually kind of three questions. So I apologize to all the other people attending. But the first one is just looking at this research, I could picture clergy being in two different camps. One of them despondent about the shape of their current congregation, one of them like enthusiastic about what's happening, right? And based on your research, what would be like a word of caution to the people who are too enthusiastic, and what would be a word of encouragement
Mhm.
for the people that are despondent? And what kind of advice would you give them on how to either maintain the momentum or um, start start rebuilding or continue rebuilding?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan, because our data really does show sort of uneven landscape, right? And so, um, by a lot of these measures, we do see this sense of optimism, and yet that's not shared for all. So I would say for those on the hyper optimistic side, who are maybe feeling like, oh wow, this is the moment that all the young people are coming into our spaces, and we're growing by leaps and bounds. I think I would say this is a good point to a good point to sort of pause and look at the demographics across the US. And the reality is, as I showed in that first slide, The mismatch across generations still persists. So we still have a disproportionate member of folks over 65 in congregations compared to the general population, and we still have fewer in the youngest generations, right? Those kind of young adults in congregations compared to the general population. So I think it's just a sort of a step back to say these larger demographic realities are still present. Um, but I'm never one to tell people not to be optimistic, so I'll let them be a bit optimistic there. But it is a sort of caution to that sort of narrative, of like, is this a revival? And the data don't show that. Um, on the other side, I would say there is something incredibly hopeful that can be embraced by even congregations that are facing financial decline, attendance decline, like these other realities around the persistence of small congregations to provide meaningful places for people to volunteer, right? Like they have the highest sort of rates of volunteering. Um, the ways in which the per capita giving is much higher in the smallest congregations. So I think for those that are, sensing that this may be they might not fit this attendance growth pattern. That there's still opportunities to think optimistically in a sense and realistically about the kinds of ways that they can continue to be a presence in their community. But I think it also, this is probably the most important thing, is important for them to be considering what partnerships are they forming, right? So I shared that story about the ways in which this gap is widening between the largest and the smallest congregations in terms of attenders, where attenders are going. Increasingly, they're just going to the big churches. But when we talk to people who attend church, um, almost half of them say they regularly participate in more than one congregation. So I think there are already these grassroots, organic ways in which people who have a religious life that includes attending a congregation are already doing this across multiple spaces. So, what kinds of new partnerships um, maybe it could be as far as a merger, but it can be as simple as we're going to share administrative staff or we're going to share our programming outreach, right? Efforts across multiple congregations, because that's already how people are living their religious lives. They're already going to a scripture study in one place, followed up by a worship service in another place, followed by sending their kids to Hebrew school somewhere else or to, a church youth group somewhere else, right? This is kind of already how we're structuring our religious lives. And so I think that's a place for those that are feeling maybe a little discouraged to say, we don't have to do it alone.
Thanks. I really appreciate all of that. And I that 50% participating in more than one congregation is actually a real
Mhm,
surprising figure to me.
mhm.
Um, the other thing that I wanted to ask, and you touched on it a little bit, is the demographic breakdown in terms of age groups. Because one thing that I've been hearing, at least a little bit, is that there's kind of more of a we've talked about like the rise of the nuns a lot and like people leaving religion altogether, but lately there seems to be a little bit resurgence among the younger crowd. Um, what kind of, based on your longitudinal research, like
Yeah.
what kind of demographic shifts are we seeing
Yep.
pre and post pandemic, right?
Yeah.
Um, can you
Yeah,
break that
that's
down
a
for us a
that's
little bit?
another great question. So when we compare younger generations to older generations, we see a couple different patterns emerge. One of them is that older generations do tend to attend worship more frequently. They tend to volunteer more often. They tend to give more financially. But for those younger participants, they are more likely to have increased their attendance over the past 5 years. So looking at the big picture, young people ages 18 to 34, they're still underrepresented in congregations compared to the overall population, like I mentioned. Um, so they're not the backbone of congregations, and they're not likely to become that. But they do show a little bit of an increase in their attendance over the past 5 years. And there are some gender distinctions. So when we look at our attender data, um, the the regular attenders, Gen Z women are less likely to be regular attenders, which matches Pew data. And this is not a story of all the young men are coming back to religion, but it's a decline among women, among Gen Z women. So women in both generations, also Gen Z, millennial, um, have higher decreases than their male counterparts. So women overall are still more likely to be in congregations, but we do see some gender shifting in the younger generations.
Interesting. Those were my two big questions. I open it up to the floor for anybody else who has some questions for you. If not, I can always ask more. But if we have some of our attendees that want to ask a couple questions, you can either put it in the chat box or you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you to ask your question. Rabbi Greenberg.
Hello. I don't want to cut your questions off, Ryan, so you certainly can ask after me. The great presentation. Thank you, Dr. Norton. I'm wondering, is there any way to correlate? I saw like the figure in 2015 was down to, I remember the number was 15%. I forget what do you know what I'm referring to? It was really low in terms of, um, was it participation? Uh,
I wonder if you're thinking of the volunteering,
It was
because
the slide right before the volunteering.
oh, right before the
Yeah.
volunteer.
Anyway,
Let me
but I'm wondering if there's any correlation.
willingness to change. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Hmm.
Is there any sense of what's going on in the country that applies to like what's going on in the congregation? Uh,
Yeah.
has there been any study of that or looking into that?
Yeah, well, so that was, yeah, 2015 was a low point, right? So we had from 2005 was the first year we asked that question, and it was like 25%, 25%, 20%. And then that, like, you're right, that
Really fell
2015
down.
gone to 16, and then it went back up to 23. So 2015 was a bit of an outlier there. Um, so I think what we're saying when we're looking at our data over these longitudinal trends, that very much what is happening in the world, right, affects these realities, right, and perceptions of willingness to change. So, we could guess about what that was, but we're not actually like collecting that data. We're just sort of looking at it and then surmising, okay, what was going on that might have contributed. Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah, you might have some better insights that than I do
We,
about
we we can get into that offline.
it. Yeah, great. Yep. And I see a question in the chat. What is driving substantial growth in congregations today? Yeah. So I mentioned that the only net growth is coming in evangelical churches that are around the mid-size. So it's not the really, really big ones, it's not the really tiny ones, it's the medium-sized ones. And so that's kind of what's driving the
Yeah.
aggregate
That
trend
gonna
line,
want
right?
me to move the car or sorry, I can move the car.
But when we think about just growth overall, a lot of those markers that I shared today um, around willingness to change, around kind of the levels of programming and what's offered, all of those things tend to kind of correlate. But, and this is the sort of the difficult part of it, is that there's also growth that's driven just based on size. So the larger you are, the more likely you are to grow. And so that's another kind of part of this dynamic. It's the largest churches have the highest percentage of growth rates. Now, of course, if you look across traditions, there are some differences here, right? So we see high growth rates in non-Christian congregations, and a lot of that is driven by immigration. When you compare across, there are some different realities. Also, we see some growth among Orthodox Christians in the U.S. It's not just immigrant driven; it's a bit immigration driven. But we've also seen some folks that are, doing that switching from Catholicism or another Christian tradition into Eastern Orthodox tradition. So there's a kind of a variety of things happening here.
Lonnie, you have your hand raised?
Yes. Dr. Norton, excellent presentation. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you guys, to follow up on the question that you just mentioned about the growth,
Yep.
do you ever do something like, what are these religions doing, these larger churches, like for the growth? I mean, I belong to a church that has something like, I think, 80,000 missionaries in the world.
Yeah.
So, but what do you guys do that type of research, and like what do they do?
Like in terms of the outreach and global.
Yeah.
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 So we do ask some questions about like their level of commitment as a congregation to outreach. But yeah, we don't really get into some of those details and particulars, but I will say that it's very clear when you look at some of the growth that is coming within, for example, mainline Protestant traditions. Oftentimes you'll find a link, particularly in urban spaces or spaces with growth due to immigration, with those transnational connections, right? So I work closely with a pastor here in Hartford who pastors a Presbyterian PCUSA congregation, and her church growth has come because of immigrants who are Presbyterians in other countries outside the U.S. And when they move to the U.S., they want to find a Presbyterian church, and so they go to her church. So there definitely is a transnational dimension to this that also is seen not just in sort of the current outreach, but you think over the modern missionary movement for Protestant and Catholic spaces, that that these transnational realities, particularly you see this very much in the Catholic Church, right? The shifts in the
Hmm.
demographic makeup of the
Yes,
Catholic Church in the US, very much tied to
very much.
national dynamics. Yep. Hmm.
Absolutely. I've actually started to attend once a month some different religions,
Yeah.
and I go to mass now once a month with a gym girlfriend.
Uh-huh.
And I actually attended her church like maybe 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And then when I went to her church,
Yeah.
she told me, I go, where's your church? And I said, oh, I know where that is. I I went there,
Mhm.
and it was completely changed by the demographics.
Yeah.
Completely when I went there
Yeah.
25 years ago when my children were little, and I would be invited to like carnivals or whatever for
Yeah.
the little kids. And now to go there,
Yeah.
I was like shocked to see the demographic change
Yep.
of the congregation,
Hmm.
and of the, I can't remember what Catholic, are they called bishops, or anyways,
Yeah.
the leaders
Yeah. Hmm.
of the congregation also
Yep.
completely changed.
Yep.
I was amazed. So I
Yep.
was like, wow, okay, I see it in the
Yeah.
Catholic Church. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Thank you.
Hmm.
And along that, with the demographics, one of the things that you talked about was a shift from smaller congregations to larger
Yeah.
congregations and
Yeah.
people kind of migrating towards that direction. Did you do any research as to why that is? Because one of the things that you also mentioned, and this is my quick little hypothesis in my brain, is that the rate of volunteerism is higher in the smaller congregations
Yeah.
because you need more people to do
Right.
things, right?
Right.
And having worshiped in small congregations and having worshiped in large congregations, sometimes it's nice to go to a large congregation, just be able to sit back and
A
not
bit
have
more
to do all the
anonymous.
things.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hmm.
So I'm curious what is driving that shift towards larger congregations from the research?
Yeah. Um, well, I think there are a few things. We have, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, but attenders report stronger belonging, that those that attend larger churches. You might think that's counterintuitive. Like, wouldn't you feel a stronger sense of belonging if you're in a small church where you know everyone? But I think one of the things that large churches do very well is that they do small groups, and the possibilities for people to form kind of smaller affinity communities within the larger whole that really give them maybe to use your kind of comment, Ryan, like a best of both worlds. So we can find our people within this bigger reality, and we can join a small group, and we can create deep relationships. But when we want to, we can just show up and not talk to anybody. So like you can pick both, right? Like you can have it's like a both and sort of situation. Um, and also, I mean, they're pretty more likely to be aggressively invitational, if you want to call it that. So there's that side of it too. I get how many of us get like flyers in the mail like to my neighbor, and it's like come visit us. And so there's that other side of it as well. Mhm.
That's really interesting. So they can use the big church as kind of the umbrella,
Yeah.
and then they can still find their little
Yes.
niche
Yeah.
within that umbrella.
And I should say we just released a mega church report just in the last week. So I'll put that
Mhm.
link in the chat here because if those of you that have more questions about the biggest churches, we have a new report out about that.
Awesome. Any other questions from everybody?
I was dropping one in the chat, but I'll say it now. Any insight into the role of online or hybrid ministry and like kind of
Yeah.
where that's going?
I have so much. I'm so glad you asked that. Um, we have seen probably the most enduring feature of the pandemic is virtual worship possibilities. And so 70% of congregations still offer a form of virtual worship. And we've seen this strikingly. I was talking with Aaron Spiegel of the Synagogue Studies Institute, who collects our synagogue data, and he was just astounded. I think synagogues it's like 88% are continuing to offer some form of virtual worship. So much higher even than just that aggregate data. Um, but there is different responses. In my interviews with clergy, there's sort of three categories. There's church leaders and congregational leaders who say, we love this thing and we want to continue and we really want to make a vibrant hybrid worship experience, right? And they're across traditions. Even the spaces that you might think wouldn't really embrace it, like Catholic priests that I was interviewing, right? You think of the liturgy and the mass and elements of the Eucharist that would require an in-person dynamic. And yet I've interviewed Catholic priests who were avid enthusiasts for forms of online worship and engagement. And then you have those that are sort of like, we're doing this because we have to. And so one of the trends that we see is that those who exclusively or primarily participate online tend to be older. So you think about people that maybe face some barriers to in-person attendance, right? They might be homebound or they might have sort of caregiving needs or other realities that makes it difficult for them to come in person, but they are still highly committed to their congregation, all the other ways, financially, right? Their attendance, they're just shifting that to a virtual space because before they maybe didn't have that possibility. So we see clergy responding to that, saying, okay, we know that we're now doing this thing that is important to a segment of our community. And then you have the folks that are, they see it as a threat. Like if we offer online, nobody's going to come in person. It's those lazy people. But I will say that our data really counter that narrative of it's the laziness or the passivity. Um, Almost 80% of people who worship online say that they are singing along or praying along or doing something along with the service. Um, Also, two-thirds of them say, oh, and we're multitasking while we're doing it too, right? We're doing something else as well. But I just think that's the distracted world that we live in. I think if you survey in-person people and say, are you also checking out your grocery cart or glancing at your email or getting a text message and responding, probably 66% of them would say, yeah, I'm also doing that in person. So I don't think that multitasking distraction is just unique to the online worshipers.
Thank you.
Gonna say the amount of times my wife has to tell me to stop playing Wordle during a service.
Exactly.
Just saying.
We've all been there. Let's just admit it.
So can I ask a quick question? This really
Yeah.
raises
Yeah.
Are you allowed to use like your cell phone electronic devices in church?
Depends on the church you go to, but it's
Okay.
hard to stop it.
Well, the beauty or the
Yeah,
beast here in the if you're a practicing Jew
yeah,
in services,
yeah.
yeah, you're not
Not so
using it, and
much.
that's
Not so
yeah, not
much.
so much.
Yeah,
Oh, I guess that's true. I guess that's really true,
Yeah,
especially the more
really,
orthodox you are.
very
yeah.
interesting.
It well, for us, uh, I belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we have, we have the New Testament, we have the Hebrew Bible, we have Doctrine and Covenants, we have so many scriptures that if we didn't just put all our scriptures on our phone, it's just too heavy. So we're always on our phone because that's how we get our scriptures. At any rate, it is time to wrap up, but I just wanted to thank you one more time, Dr. Norton, for all of your research today, for your willingness to participate in this. This was one of the most fascinating presentations I've heard in a long time. So many, many thanks for everybody that's attending. Just one more reminder that we do have these are monthly webinars. Um, if you don't get the Zoom link, please reach out to Jenny. She will give you the Zoom link if you've registered and found that you didn't get the actual login information. And then April 15th to 17th is our next convention in Salt Lake City. We hope to see you all there. But thank you so much once again, Dr. Norton, for
Yeah.
everything.
Great being with you.
Thank
Have
you.
a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Take care. Thank you.